The wind howled through the mountain pass like the cry of something ancient and forgotten, carrying with it the bitter cold that had become Alara's only constant companion. She wrapped her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way up the familiar path to the old shrine, her boots crunching through the fresh layer of snow that had fallen during the afternoon. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood, orange and deep purple, and she knew she had to hurry. The creatures that prowled these mountains after dark were not kind to those caught outside without protection, though in truth, Alara sometimes wondered if being devoured by some beast might be a mercy compared to the slow death of loneliness she endured each day. The shrine stood where it had always stood, a small stone structure half-collapsed and covered in centuries of moss and ice. At its center, rising from a pedestal of cracked marble, was the statue. It depicted a warrior of impossible beauty and strength, his features sharp and noble, his body carved with such exquisite detail that sometimes Alara could swear she saw his chest rise and fall with breath. The statue showed him in armor that no longer existed in this world, holding a sword that legend said could cut through the very fabric of reality itself. His eyes, though made of stone, seemed to look directly at her with an intensity that made her heart ache in ways she could not explain. This was Kale, the guardian of the North, the defender of the innocent, the one who had stood against the cruel gods themselves and paid the ultimate price for his defiance. Alara knelt before the statue as she did every night, her knees finding the worn spots in the stone floor where she had knelt so many times before. She clasped her hands together and closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of solitude pressing down on her shoulders. In the village far below, life continued without her. After her parents had died from the wasting sickness 5 years ago. The villagers had feared she carried the curse in her blood. They had driven her out, forced her to make her home in this abandoned cabin on the mountainside, and forbidden anyone from speaking to her or offering her aid. She had survived through her own resourcefulness, foraging and hunting, but the isolation had carved deep wounds in her soul that no medicine could heal. If you are enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these tales of supernatural romance and ancient magic. She began to speak, her voice soft and trembling in the cold air. She told the statue about her day, about the rabbit she had managed to trap for her dinner, about the way the ice had formed beautiful patterns on her window that morning, about the ache in her chest that never seemed to go away, no matter how many days passed. She told him about her dreams, strange and vivid dreams of another life, where she wore white robes and stood in temples filled with golden light, where she spoke words of power that made the very air shimmer with magic. She told him about the loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole, about how some nights she considered simply walking out into the snow and letting the cold take her. What Alara did not know, could not possibly know, was that every word she spoke was heard. Inside the prison of stone that had been his body for 1,000 years, Kale listened with a consciousness that had never dimmed, despite the curse that bound him. He had heard countless voices over the centuries, prayers and pleas and desperate bargains, but they had all faded into meaningless noise, the static of mortal suffering that he could do nothing to ease. But her voice was different. From the very first night she had come to the shrine, something in the cadence of her words, the particular frequency of her pain, had cut through the fog of his endless imprisonment like a blade of pure light. He knew her. Not this incarnation. Not this fragile mortal girl with her haunted eyes and trembling hands, but the soul that resided within her. He would know that soul anywhere, across any span of time or death. It was Liana, his Liana, the high priestess who had loved him when he was still flesh and blood, who had stood beside him when he had challenged the dark gods, who demanded human sacrifice to sustain their power. It was Liana who had woven the spell that had saved him from complete destruction when the gods had struck him down, who had poured her own life force into the stone to keep his consciousness alive, hoping that someday, somehow, the curse might be broken. For 1,000 years he had waited in the darkness of his stone prison, feeling the world change around him, feeling empires rise and fall, feeling the magic that had once been abundant in the world slowly fade away. He had felt Liana's soul pass on, felt it return in new bodies again and again, but never close enough for him to reach, never in a form that carried enough of the old magic to hear his silent screams. But this girl, this Ilara, she was different. She came to him every night, and with each prayer, each tear that fell upon his stone form, he felt the curse weakening just a fraction, felt the smallest measure of warmth return to his frozen existence. Tonight, as Ilara spoke about a dream she had experienced where she saw a warrior made of living stone who wept tears of silver, Kale felt something shift inside his prison. The words she was using, though she spoke them without understanding their significance, were echoing the ancient incantations that Liana had used to create the spell. She was unknowingly recreating the ritual, piece by piece, night by night, her natural magical affinity guiding her, even though she had no training, no knowledge of what she was doing. The cracks in his curse were spreading, thin lines of possibility running through the stone that bound him. Ilara finished her prayer as she always did, with a simple phrase that she had made up herself, but that somehow felt right, felt necessary. She whispered into the cold air, her breath forming clouds of mist that seemed to glow faintly in the dying light. She said the words without knowing they were words of power, without understanding that she was speaking in a language that had not been heard in the mortal world for 10 centuries. She said them because they felt like coming home, like remembering something she had always known, but had forgotten until this very moment. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The ground beneath her knees began to tremble, and the air around the statue started to shimmer with energy that made her hair stand on end and her skin prickle with goosebumps. Ilara scrambled backward, her heart pounding with fear, as she watched the impossible happen before her eyes. The stone of the statue was cracking, not crumbling but transforming, pieces of it falling away to reveal something underneath that glowed with an inner light that was neither fire nor star, but something altogether more ancient and powerful. She wanted to run, every instinct in her body screaming at her to flee, but she found herself frozen in place, unable to look away as the statue that had been her only companion began to move. The stone that had covered him, like a shell, was breaking apart, and beneath it was flesh, real, living flesh that was pale as moonlight and marked with scars that glowed with silver light. His armor was no longer stone, but metal that seemed to absorb the darkness around it, and in his hand, the sword was suddenly real, its blade humming with power that made the air vibrate. Kale opened his eyes for the first time in 1,000 years, and the world rushed back to him in a flood of sensation that nearly drove him to his knees. He could feel the cold wind on his face, could smell the pine and ice, and the faint, sweet scent of the girl who knelt before him in terror. He could hear her heart hammering in her chest, could see the way her hands shook as she stared at him with eyes that were exactly the same shade of green that Liana's had been, exactly the same shape, though the face that contained them was different, younger, marked by hardship rather than privilege. He tried to speak, to tell her not to be afraid, but his voice came out as a harsh rasp, the sound of stone grinding against stone. He had not used his vocal cords in a millennium, and they protested the attempt. He took a step toward her, his movements stiff and uncertain, and watched as she finally broke free from her paralysis and stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet in her haste to get away from him. The fear in her eyes was like a knife to his heart, but he could not blame her. He must look like a monster to her, something that should not exist, something that violated every natural law. Before he could take another step, before he could try again to speak, the sun completed its descent below the horizon, and darkness fell across the mountain like a curtain. The moment the last ray of light disappeared, Kyle felt the curse slam back into him with the force of a physical blow. His body seized up, his muscles turning back to stone, and he had just enough time to see the horror and confusion on Ilara's face before he was trapped again, frozen in a new position. One arm extended toward her as if reaching for help that would never come. The curse was broken enough that he could manifest at night, but not enough to sustain him during the day. He was caught between two states, neither fully free nor fully imprisoned, and the agony of it was almost worse than the complete numbness he had endured before. Ilara watched as the impossible man turned back into stone before her eyes, and she pressed her fist against her, mouth to stifle the scream that wanted to tear itself from her throat. She sat there in the snow for long minutes, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed, trying to convince herself that it had been a hallucination brought on by hunger or cold or the madness that came from too much isolation. But the statue was different now, unmistakably different. It stood in a new pose, reaching toward where she had been kneeling, and the expression on its face was no longer the noble serenity it had shown before, but something desperate and pleading. She fled down the mountain path in a blind panic, not caring about the creatures that might be lurking in the shadows, not caring about anything except putting distance between herself and the impossible thing she had witnessed. She burst into her small cabin and barred the door, then spent the entire night huddled in the corner with a knife clutched in her trembling hands, jumping at every sound, expecting at any moment for a creature of living stone to tear through her walls and drag her away to some terrible fate. But nothing came. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching into an eternity, and when the first rays of dawn finally crept through her window, Ilara had not slept at all. She was exhausted and terrified and confused, but she was also curious in a way that she could not deny. What had happened at the shrine? Had the statue truly come to life? Or had her mind finally broken under the weight of her loneliness? There was only one way to find out, but the thought of returning to that place filled her with dread. She spent the day trying to distract herself with chores, mending clothes that did not need mending, organizing supplies that were already organized, anything to keep her mind occupied. But as the sun began to set once again, she found herself drawn back to the path that led up the mountain. She told herself she was being foolish, that she should stay in her cabin where it was safe, but her feet carried her forward as if they had a will of their own. She had to know. She had to understand what she had seen. The shrine looked exactly as it had always looked when she arrived, the statue standing in its new pose with that expression of desperate longing frozen on its face. Ilara approached slowly, keeping several feet of distance between herself and the figure, her body tensed and ready to run at the first sign of movement. She watched as the sun sank lower and lower, and the moment darkness claimed the mountain. The transformation began again. This time she did not run. She forced herself to stay in place, to watch as the stone cracked and fell away. As the living man emerged once more from his prison, he moved more easily this time, his body remembering how to be flesh, and when he opened his eyes and saw her standing there, the relief on his face was so profound that it made something twist in Ilara's chest. Kale cleared his throat, working his jaw, and when he spoke this time, his voice was rough but understandable, carrying an accent that belonged to no living language, but that somehow sounded right to Ilara's ears. He said her name, not the name she had been given in this life, but another name, an older name that resonated in her bones like the ringing of a bell. He said Lyanna, and the sound of it made tears spring to her eyes for reasons she could not explain. He told her everything, the words spilling out of him in a rush as if he feared he would not have time to finish before the dawn came and stole his voice away again. He told her about the dark gods who had demanded tribute in blood, about how he had been the champion of the mortal races who had stood against them, about the high priestess who had loved him and fought beside him. He told her about the curse, about the 1,000 years of imprisonment, about how her prayers had been slowly breaking the spell that bound him. He told her that she was the reincarnation of his lost love, that her soul had returned to finish what had been started so long ago. Ilara listened to his story with a mixture of disbelief and strange recognition, because somewhere deep inside her, in a place she had never fully acknowledged, his words rang true. The dreams she had been having, the sense of something missing from her life, the way she had always felt like she was waiting for something without knowing what. It all suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. She wanted to deny it, wanted to call him mad or call herself mad, but she could not. The truth of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak, and she realized that her life had been leading to this moment, that every lonely night, and every desperate prayer had been preparation for something much larger than she had ever imagined. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see how Alara and Kale's story unfolds, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Trust me, what happens next will leave you absolutely breathless. Over the following nights, as Kale manifested each time darkness fell and returned to stone each dawn, a strange relationship developed between them. Alara brought him food and water, though he could not consume them in his half-cursed state, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing. She told him about her life, about the pain of being cast out from her village, and he listened with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. He told her stories of the ancient world, of magic that had filled the air like music, of cities that had risen so high they touched the clouds, of a time when gods walked among mortals, and the line between the two was thin and permeable. As they talked, Alara began to experience flashes of memory that were not her own, or perhaps were her own, from a life she had lived before. She saw herself in white robes, standing in a temple of white marble, saw herself performing rituals that called down the power of the stars themselves. She saw Kale as he had been before the curse, his face alive with passion and conviction, his hands gentle as they cupped her face and drew her close for a kiss that tasted of forever. The memories came in fragments, never complete, always leaving her with more questions than answers. But they were enough to convince her that what Kale said was true. But with understanding came danger. The dark gods who had cursed Kale were not truly gone, merely banished to a realm beyond, the mortal world, and they had been watching and waiting for any sign that the seal holding them back might weaken. The moment Alara began breaking Kale's curse, she had unknowingly sent out a beacon of magical energy that alerted them to her presence. They could not cross over themselves, not yet, but they could send their servants, creatures of shadow and malice, that had been bred for the sole purpose of destroying those who opposed the god's will. The attacks began on the 7th night, after Kale's partial awakening. Alara was in her cabin preparing to make her nightly trip to the shrine when she heard scratching at her door, a sound like claws on wood that made every hair on her body stand up in primal fear. She grabbed the knife she kept for skinning game and backed away from the door, watching in horror as the wood began to splinter and crack under the force of whatever was outside. The creature that burst through was a nightmare-made flesh, a thing with too many limbs and eyes, that glowed with sickly green light, its body seemingly made of living shadow that writhed and twisted in ways that hurt to look at. Alara screamed and threw her knife at the creature, but the blade passed through its body as if it were smoke. The thing lunged at her, its claws extended, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die. But then the window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood, and Kyle was there. Somehow there, despite the sun having not yet fully set, his body still partially stone but moving with desperate speed. He threw himself between Alara and the creature, his sword materializing in his hand as if summoned from the air itself, and the blade that had been forged to kill gods cut through the shadow creature like it was nothing more than mist. The creature dissolved with a shriek that shattered the remaining glass in the cabin, and Kale staggered, his body fighting to return to its stone state now that the immediate threat was past. Alara caught him as he fell, her arms wrapping around his torso, and she was shocked by the weight of him, by the way his skin felt like warm marble under her hands. She helped him outside where the last rays of sunlight were fading, and the moment darkness claimed the world, his body stabilized into flesh and blood once more. He looked at her with eyes full of ancient sorrow, and told her what she had already begun to suspect. The creatures would keep coming, more and more of them, growing stronger with each attack, because the dark gods knew that she was the key to Kale's complete liberation, and they would do anything to prevent that from happening. The only way to truly end the threat, the only way to ensure her safety and his freedom, was to complete the ritual that Liana had started 1,000 years ago. But completing the ritual would require them to gather 3 artifacts that had been scattered across the realm, hidden in places of great danger, protected by guardians both mortal and supernatural. Alara made her decision without hesitation, though it terrified her to her core. She would help Kale complete the ritual, would face whatever dangers lay ahead, because the alternative was to spend the rest of her short life running from creatures that would eventually tear her apart. And beyond the practical considerations, beyond the fear and the uncertainty, there was something else drawing her forward. When she looked at Kyle, when she heard his voice, or felt his presence, she felt a pull that went deeper than anything she had ever experienced. It was not just attraction, though he was devastatingly beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel, but recognition. Her soul knew his, and no amount of logic or fear could change that fundamental truth. Their journey began that very night, with Kale carrying her down the mountain path at a speed that should have been impossible, his supernatural strength making it easy despite his half-cursed state. They traveled by night and hid during the day when he was forced back into stone form, and Alara quickly learned to be efficient in making camp and gathering supplies during the daylight hours while he stood frozen and helpless. It was strange and frightening to see him trapped that way, to watch the sunset and wait for him to come back to life. But it became their new routine, their new reality. The first artifact they sought was the Moonstone Crown, an ancient relic that had been worn by the Wao, high priestesses of Liana's order, and that contained within it the crystallized essence of the moon itself. According to the legends Kale remembered, it had been hidden in a temple deep in the Whispering Woods, a forest that had grown strange and deadly in the centuries since the old magic had faded from the world. The trees there were said to move when no one was looking, and travelers who entered the woods were rarely seen again. They reached the edge of the Whispering Woods 5 nights after, leaving Alara's mountain cabin, and even from a distance, Alara could feel that something was deeply wrong with the place. The trees were too tall and too close together, their branches weaving overhead to create a canopy so thick that no moonlight penetrated to the forest floor. The air that wafted from between the trunks smelled of decay and old magic, and she could hear sounds that might have been wind through leaves, but might also have been whispered words in languages she did not understand. Kale hesitated at the forest's edge, his expression troubled in a way that made Alara's stomach clench with anxiety. He told her that the woods had not been like this when he had last walked the mortal world, that something had corrupted the natural growth and turned it into something twisted and malevolent. He suspected the influence of the dark gods, a lingering poison they had left in the world before their banishment. But he could not be certain. What he did know was that entering the forest would be incredibly dangerous, and that there was a very real possibility they might not emerge from it alive. Alara took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his larger ones, and told him that she was not turning back now. She had come too far, and risked too much to give up when they were so close to their goal. Besides, she pointed out with a grim smile, what was the alternative? They could stay out here in the open, where the shadow creatures could find them easily, or they could take their chances with whatever horrors waited in the woods. At least in the forest, they might find what they needed to end this nightmare once and for all. They entered the Whispering Woods together, and immediately Alara understood why it bore that name. The sounds around them were constant and maddening, voices that seemed to speak just below the threshold of understanding, always on the edge of making sense but never quite getting there. The whispers seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the shadows that pooled beneath their roots, from the very air that pressed against Alara's skin like cold, clammy hands. The journey through the forest was a nightmare that stretched on for hours that felt like days. The trees did move when they were not looking directly at them, closing paths that had been open moments before, creating false trails that led in circles. More than once, Alara could have sworn she saw faces in the bark of the trees, twisted expressions of pain and madness that watched them pass with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Kale kept his sword drawn at all times, the blade's glow providing their only light, and several times they were attacked by creatures that seemed to be made from the forest itself, animate tangles of roots and vines that tried to drag them down into the earth. But they pressed on, following the pull of ancient magic that Kale could sense like a compass pointing north. And eventually, they reached the heart of the forest where the temple stood. It was a ruin, its white marble walls stained green with moss and age, its roof collapsed in several places, but it still radiated a sense of holiness that made the whispering voices fall silent. The moment they crossed the threshold into the temple proper, the oppressive weight of the forest lifted, and Alara could breathe freely for the first time since entering the woods. The moonstone crown sat on an altar at the center of the temple, exactly where Kaeli remembered it being placed 1,000 years ago. It was a delicate thing, woven from silver wire and set with stones that glowed with soft lunar light. And when Alara reached out to touch it, she felt a shock of recognition that nearly drove her to her knees. This crown had rested on her head in another life, had marked her as the chosen of the moon goddess, had been the symbol of her authority and power. Memories flooded through her, so many that she could not process them all. Images of rituals and ceremonies and quiet moments spent in contemplation of the divine. She lifted the crown from the altar with trembling hands and turned to show it to Kale. But the words died in her throat when she saw his expression. He was staring at her with such raw emotion that it stole her breath away, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and she realized that seeing her hold that crown again after all these centuries must be overwhelming for him. She started to say something, anything to break the tension of the moment, but he moved before she could speak, crossing the space between them in 2 long strides and pulling her into his arms with a desperation that bordered on violence. His lips found hers in a kiss that was 1,000 years in the making, and Alara felt something inside her unlock and open like a flower to the sun. She kissed him back with equal fervor, the crown falling forgotten to the floor as she wrapped her arms around his neck and poured everything she felt into that single point of contact. It was not gentle or sweet, but fierce and claiming. A reminder that they had been separated for lifetimes and that every moment they had together now was precious beyond measure. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kyle rested his forehead against hers and spoke words in the ancient language that Alara somehow understood. He told her that he loved her, had loved her across time and death, would love her until the stars themselves burned out and the universe went cold and silent. He told her that he would do anything to keep her safe, would burn the world to ash if that was what it took to protect her. And she believed every word because she could feel the truth of them resonating in her very bones. They stayed in the temple for the rest of the night, holding each other as dawn approached, and Kale's body began its inevitable transformation back to stone. Alara placed the moonstone crown carefully in the pack she carried and settled herself against Kale's stone form, determined to keep watch over him during the vulnerable daylight hours. She dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with images of the life she had lived before, and when she woke, it was to the sound of footsteps approaching the temple. She scrambled to her feet, her hand going to the knife at her belt, and watched as figures emerged from the forest shadows. They were humans, or at least they had been once, but something had changed them. Their eyes were vacant and glassy, their movements jerky and unnatural, and when they opened their mouths, the whispers of the forest poured out like water from a broken dam. They had been consumed by the corruption of the woods, transformed into extensions of its will, and they advanced on Alara with clear hostile intent. She fought as best she could, her knife flashing in the dim light that filtered through the temple ruins. But there were too many of them, and she was only one woman with limited combat experience. They overwhelmed her through sheer numbers, bearing her down to the floor, and she screamed for Kale even though she knew he could not help her while trapped in stone. She felt cold hands wrapping around her throat, cutting off her air, and darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision. But then the hands released her, and she heard sounds of violence and terror. She dragged herself to her hands and knees, gasping for air, and saw something impossible. Kale was moving despite the sun still, being high in the sky, his body flickering between stone and flesh in a strobe effect that was nauseating to watch. He was fighting the corrupted humans with savage efficiency, his sword cutting through them not to kill, but to disable, to free them from whatever force controlled them. The strain of maintaining his physical form during daylight was clearly enormous, his face twisted in agony, blood that looked like liquid silver pouring from his nose and ears. But he did not stop until every last one of the corrupted had been rendered unconscious. The moment the last body fell, Kale collapsed, his body slamming back into full stone form with a sound like thunder. Ilara crawled to him, her hands frantically checking his stone face for any sign of damage, terrified that his desperate act had somehow made the curse worse. But he seemed unchanged, and she had no choice but to wait for nightfall to see if he would emerge again, or if his sacrifice had cost him everything. The wait was agony, every minute stretching into an eternity, but when darkness finally fell and Kale transformed back into flesh, Ilara nearly wept with relief. He was weak and disoriented, the effort of manifesting during daylight having taken a massive toll, but he was alive and conscious. He told her, as she helped him drink water and eat the small amount of food he could consume in his half-cursed state, that the depth of their connection, the strength of Liana's soul within Ilara, had given him the power to break through the curse temporarily when she had been in mortal danger. It was a good sign, he said. Proof that the ritual was working, even though they had not yet completed it. They left the Whispering Woods that night, moving as quickly as Kale's weakened state would allow, and when they finally emerged into open land under a clear sky full of stars, Ilara wanted to fall to her knees and kiss the ground. The second artifact they needed was the Sunfire Blade, a weapon that had been forged by the gods themselves before they had turned dark and cruel, and it was said to be hidden in the ruins of the Sky Citadel, a fortress that hung suspended in the clouds above the highest mountain range in the realm. The journey to the Sky Citadel took them across the breadth of the realm, through lands that Ilara had never seen and could barely imagine. They passed through cities where people went about their lives in blissful ignorance of the ancient magics stirring in the world, through farmlands, and forests and deserts that stretched to the horizon. Everywhere they went, they found signs that the dark god's influence was growing stronger, that the barriers holding them back were weakening. Strange creatures appeared in places they should not be. The weather turned violent and unpredictable, and people spoke in hushed whispers of nightmares that felt too real, and visions that warned of coming apocalypse. Kale explained to her as they traveled that by breaking his curse, they were inadvertently weakening the greater seal that held the dark gods in their prison. The two magics were linked, woven together by Liana in her final desperate act, and as one unraveled, so did the other. It meant that they were in a race against time, that they needed to complete the ritual and claim the power it would grant them before the gods broke free completely. If they failed, if they were too slow, the dark gods would return to the mortal realm, and the age of blood and sacrifice would begin anew. The mountains that housed the Sky Citadel were treacherous and deadly, their peaks shrouded in clouds that crackled with unnatural lightning. Local legends said that anyone who tried to climb them would be struck down by the wrath of the heavens, and the bones of countless ambitious fools littered the lower slopes as testament to the truth of those warnings. But Kale knew a secret way, a hidden path that had been used by the sky priests of old, and he led Ilara up through passages so narrow they had to turn sideways to fit, across bridges of ice that spanned bottomless chasms, through caves where the wind howled like tortured souls. The climb took 3 nights, with Ilara having to make camps in impossibly precarious locations during the days while Kale stood frozen beside her, a statue of stone that somehow provided comfort even in his immobility. On the 3rd night, they finally reached the cloud layer and stepped out onto a platform of white stone that floated in the air, with no visible means of support. Above them, the Sky Citadel hung like a jewel suspended in the heavens, its towers and walls glowing with soft golden light. And it was the most beautiful thing Ilara had ever seen. They crossed to the citadel on a bridge made of solidified clouds that felt disturbingly insubstantial under Ilara's feet, and entered through gates that stood open as if they had been waiting for visitors. The interior of the citadel was pristine and untouched by time, as if the centuries had simply passed it by without leaving any mark. The halls were filled with treasures beyond imagining, artifacts of the old world that would have made Ilara unimaginably wealthy if she had any way to carry them down from this place. But she had eyes only for the chamber at the citadel's heart, where the Sunfire Blade waited. The blade rested in a pedestal of crystal, and the moment Ilara laid eyes on it, she knew that claiming it would not be as simple as lifting it and walking away. The weapon radiated power so intense it made the air shimmer and warp around it, and when Cale tried to approach it, he was thrown backward by an invisible force that sent him crashing into the far wall. The blade, it seemed, would only allow itself to be claimed by one who proved themselves worthy, and the test it demanded was one of fire and pain. Alara stepped forward despite Cale's protests, her hand reaching for the hilt of the blade, and the moment her fingers made contact, agony exploded. Through her body, the weapon was testing her, burning away everything false and weak to see what remained, and Alara screamed as her skin blistered and her nerves sang with pain. But she did not let go, did not pull back, because she understood that this was necessary, that to wield power meant to be willing to suffer for it. She held on through the pain, her will pitted against the ancient magic of the blade, and eventually, after what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds, the fire faded and the sword accepted her. The moment she lifted the sunfire blade from its pedestal, Alara felt power flood through her like nothing she had ever experienced. Memories that were not hers rushed into her mind, memories of every hand that had ever wielded this weapon, every battle it had fought, every life it had taken, and every life it had saved. She saw the god who had forged it, saw the love and care they had put into every stroke of the hammer, before corruption had twisted them into something monstrous. She saw Lyanna wielding this very blade in defense of the innocent, saw Cale fighting beside her with his own weapon raised high, and she understood that this was not just a tool, but a legacy, a responsibility passed down through the ages. When she finally lowered the blade and turned to look at Cale, she saw awe and pride and love in his eyes, and she knew that she had passed his test as well as the blades. They had 2 of the 3 artifacts now, and only one remained, but it was the most dangerous to obtain, the one that would require them to face their greatest fears and deepest doubts. The 3rd artifact was the Heart of Eternity, a gem that contained within it a fragment of the universe's first moment, the instant of creation itself. It had been hidden not in a place but in a person, passed down through a bloodline that stretched back to the age of gods, and the current keeper of the heart was a recluse who lived in a tower at the edge of the world where reality itself grew thin and strange. Reaching them would require crossing the Shattered Lands, a region where the barriers between dimensions had fractured and where the laws of nature no longer applied in any consistent way. The Shattered Lands were exactly as terrible as Cale had warned. They entered a place of constant impossibility, where gravity might suddenly reverse or cease to exist altogether, where time flowed at different rates in different locations, so that Alara could watch Cale age and grow young again in the space of a single step, where the sky might be below them and the ground above, where colors had sounds and sounds had tastes. It was maddening and nauseating, and Alara clung to Cale's hand like it was the only real thing in a world gone completely mad. They fought creatures in the Shattered Lands that defied description, things that existed in too many dimensions or not enough, monsters that were their own worst fears, given form and malice. Alara wielded the sunfire blade with growing confidence, its power flowing through her as naturally as breathing, and Cale fought beside her with the desperate ferocity of someone who had everything to lose. Together, they carved a path through the chaos, moving always toward the faint beacon of stable reality that marked the location of the tower they sought. When they finally reached the tower, they found it was less a structure and more a concept, a place that existed because someone had decided it should exist and maintained its reality through sheer force of will. The keeper who emerged to meet them was ancient beyond measure, a being who had lived so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be fully human. They looked at Alara and Kyle with eyes that had seen the birth and death of stars, and they spoke in a voice that sounded like the echo of eternity itself. The keeper told them that they had been waiting for this moment, had known it would come since the day the dark gods had been sealed away. They had maintained the heart of eternity all these long centuries, keeping it safe until the time came when it would be needed to finish what had been started so long ago. But they would not simply hand it over, because the heart was a thing of immense power and potential, and to give it to someone who might misuse it would be a betrayal of their sacred duty. Alara and Kale were subjected to a test unlike any they had faced before, a trial that forced them to confront not monsters or physical dangers, but the darkest parts of themselves. They were shown visions of futures that might come to pass, worlds where their choices led to suffering and death, on a scale that dwarfed anything the dark gods had ever done. They were forced to answer impossible questions about morality and sacrifice, about whether it was right to save one life at the cost of 1,000, about whether peace achieved through force was truly peace at all. The trial broke Alara down to her fundamental core, stripped away every defense and pretense, and left her raw and vulnerable in a way that was more frightening than any physical threat. She saw herself as she truly was, flawed and frightened, and far from the hero she had imagined herself becoming, and she wept for the weight of what she was being asked to carry. But she also saw her strength, saw the love that bound her to Kale and the determination that had carried her this far, and she understood that being a hero was not about being perfect, but about choosing to stand and fight, even when every instinct screamed to run and hide. When the trial finally ended, the keeper looked at them both with something that might have been approval, or might have been pity. It was hard to say with a being so far removed from human emotion. They told Alara and Kale that they had passed, that they had proven themselves worthy of bearing the burden of the heart of eternity. But they also warned them that the path ahead would only grow more difficult. Completing the ritual would require a sacrifice, the keeper said, and the price might be higher than either of them was willing to pay. The keeper handed Alara a crystal that pulsed with light, that seemed to contain entire galaxies within its depths. And the moment she took it, she felt the weight of destiny settle over her like a physical thing. She had all 3 artifacts now, everything they needed to complete the ritual and break Kale's curse fully. But the keeper's warning echoed in her mind and filled her with dread. What sacrifice would be required? What would she be asked to give up? They left the tower and made the nightmarish journey back through the shattered lands. And with each step, Alara's anxiety grew. Kale sensed her distress and tried to comfort her, but his own fears were clearly mounting as well. He had not told her everything about the ritual, she realized, had been keeping something back, and when she finally confronted him about it, he broke down and confessed. The terrible truth, the ritual that would break his curse and seal the dark gods away forever, required the willing sacrifice of a soul, a pure offering of life force that would power the magic and make it permanent. In the original version of the ritual, Lyanna had intended to sacrifice herself, to pour her entire being into the spell and cease to exist so that Kale could live and the gods could be defeated. But Kale had discovered her plan at the last moment and had tried to stop her, had fought to find another way. And in the chaos and confusion, the spell had gone wrong. Instead of dying completely, Lyanna had managed to preserve both their souls at the cost of trapping Kale in stone and dooming herself to endless reincarnation without memory or power. This time, Kale told her with tears streaming down his face, there was no way around the sacrifice. One of them would have to die, truly and completely, their soul consumed to fuel the ritual. He had been planning all along to be the one to make that sacrifice, to finally give Alara the peace and safety she deserved, even if it meant his own obliteration. He would rather cease to exist than watch her suffer any longer, would rather face the final darkness than let the dark gods claim even one more innocent life. Alara listened to his confession with her heart breaking, and when he finished, she told him in no uncertain terms that she would not accept his sacrifice, would not let him throw himself away like that. If someone had to die, she said, then it would be her, because she was the one with the power to cast the spell. She was the one who carried Lyanna's knowledge and skill. Besides, she pointed out with a sad smile, what kind of life would she have in this world without him? She had been alone and forgotten before they met, and she would not go back to that existence. She would rather burn bright and briefly, would rather have these few precious weeks with him than decades of empty loneliness. They argued about it for hours, each insisting that they should be the one to die, each trying to save the other from the ultimate sacrifice. But in the end, exhausted and emotionally spent, they agreed that they could not make this decision now, not while they were both overwrought and afraid. They would wait until the moment came. until they were actually performing the ritual, and then they would see what choice presented itself. Comment below and tell me if you think there is a way for both of them to survive, or if one of them must truly die. I love reading your theories and ideas, so please share your thoughts. They returned to the shrine where this had all begun, the small stone structure on the mountain, where Alara had prayed every night for so long. It seemed fitting that this was where it would end, where the circle would finally close. They waited for the night when all 3 moons would be full, when the barriers between worlds would be at their thinnest and the magic would be at its strongest. During the days leading up to that night, they did not speak much, both of them lost in their own thoughts, both trying to come to terms with what was about to happen. On the final day, as the sun set and the moons began to rise, Alara laid out the 3 artifacts in a triangle around the pedestal where Kale's statue had once stood. She wore the moonstone crown on her head, held the sunfire blade in her hand, and placed the heart of eternity at the center of the formation. Kale stood beside her, his body fully flesh. For the first time since his curse had begun to break, the proximity to so much concentrated magic having temporarily stabilized his form, Alara began to speak the words of the ritual, words that flowed from her lips as if she had known them her entire life, and power began to build in the air around them. The artifacts glowed brighter and brighter, their light merging and spiraling upward to paint the night sky with colors that had no names. She could feel the magic responding to her call, could feel the curse that bound Kyle beginning to shatter, and the seals on the dark gods beginning to reform, stronger than ever before. But as the ritual reached its crescendo, as the moment came when the sacrifice would be required, something unexpected happened. The heart of eternity pulsed once with blinding light, and Alara heard a voice that she recognized as the keeper from the tower. They spoke directly into her mind, their words clear as crystal, and they told her that there was another way, a third option that neither she nor Kale had considered. The ritual did not require a death, the keeper explained, but a transformation. 2 souls could become one, could merge and fuse into something new and different, something that was both and neither of them. It would mean losing their individual identities, losing the people they had been, but it would also mean creating something beautiful and powerful enough to sustain the ritual without any true death. They would become a new being, a guardian who was part human and part ancient magic, capable of walking the line between mortal and divine. Alara looked at Kale, saw the same desperate hope in his eyes that she felt in her heart, and she knew what her answer would be. She would rather exist as part of something shared with him than exist alone and whole without him. She spoke her agreement aloud, and Kale added his voice to hers, their words harmonizing in a way that made the very air sing with resonance. The transformation was indescribable, a sensation of coming apart and reforming, of every atom of her being reaching out to touch every atom of his, of memories and experiences and emotions blending together until she could not tell where she ended and he began. She felt his 1,000 years of imprisonment, as if she had lived them, felt his love for Liana stretching back across time, and she poured her own experiences into him in return, her loneliness and pain and quiet, strength becoming part of their shared existence. When it was over, when the light faded and the ritual completed, what stood in the shrine was no longer Alara or Kale, but something new. They existed in a single body that shifted between forms, sometimes appearing as Alara, sometimes as Kale, sometimes as something that was neither and both. They had become the Guardian Reborn, a being of immense power, tasked with protecting the mortal realm from threats both mundane and supernatural, capable of existing indefinitely, without aging or dying, but also capable of feeling and loving and living as humans did. The dark gods were sealed away completely. The curse was broken, and the world was safe. The merged being that had once been Alara and Kyle walked down from the mountain shrine and out into the world, ready to begin their new existence as a legend made real, as a story that would be told for generations to come. They were no longer alone, would never be alone again, because they carried each other within themselves always, two souls sharing one eternal dance. In the village that had once cast out Alara, people spoke in whispers of a mysterious figure who appeared in times of crisis, who saved the innocent and punished the wicked with a sword of sunfire and a crown of moonlight. They called the figure the guardian of the lost, the protector of the forgotten. And they left offerings at shrines that sprang up in places where the guardian had been seen. They did not know the truth of what they worshipped, did not understand that their guardian was born from a love so powerful it had transcended death itself. But perhaps that was for the best. Some truths were too large and too beautiful to be contained in simple words. The guardian traveled the world for years and decades and centuries, appearing wherever they were needed, and with each act of kindness and justice, they remembered what it meant to be human, even while wielding the power of gods. They never forgot the lonely woman who had prayed every night to a statue, or the ancient warrior who had been trapped in stone, because those two people were the foundation upon which they were built. They were the answer to Alara's prayers, the fulfillment of Kale's desperate hope, and they were proof that sometimes love is strong enough to change the rules, to rewrite destiny itself. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, the guardians spoke to themselves in two voices that harmonized perfectly, if sometimes they laughed with double joy or cried with double sorrow, well, that was simply the price and the privilege of being something magnificently impossible, something that should not exist but did anyway, something born from sacrifice and choice and love that would not be denied. They were complete, they were whole, they were everything they needed to be, and they would stand guard over the world they loved for as long as the stars continued to shine.